Hello everyone, Ace here, and today I bring once again something rather special from short Fat Otaku, aka Dev, who has now taken up the position that the far left actually condemns hypocrisy and doesn't just ignore it, which is of course part of his ongoing attempts to frame the far left as at least not being as bad as the far right. Now, I will admit that I have been on the fence of covering this particular take of Dev for a while now for a couple of reasons which you are going to be seeing throughout this video. One of those reasons being an out-of-context clip, which is key to the discussion of this whole video, though thankfully Dev does, as you will see, fully agree with the position he took in the clip with what context was provided, which logically can be deduced that this clip does show what Dev's opinion actually is. Additionally, this conversation started off with a different topic, and later on moved to a completely different topic altogether, so for the purpose of staying on topic in this particular video, we will only be covering the parts that are actually relevant to the actual discussion at hand, which is whether or not the far left actually cares about hypocrisy within far leftist ideology. To start off, this discussion began with, of all topics, a Twitch streamer who happened to be trans getting caught cheating while playing the Battlefield 6 open beta and getting punished by Twitch as a result. If only that particular streamer had identified as not a cheater, then they would have gotten away with it. But as previously mentioned, this is not relevant to the actual discussion that we'll be covering today, and so let's skip ahead a little bit. As Dev replies with a quote tweet to Minorically Geflictive 1488, who shall, for the remainder of the video, be referred to as Minorically, because I don't feel like earning the ire of YouTube today. But anyways, when Minorically tweeted out, quote, "You're sexually attracted to trans women," Dev responded with a quote tweet saying, quote, "and," which also includes a picture of the Giga Chad face. To which Minorically responds with, quote, "and you have possibly the worst political take in human history," in which Minorically provides a quote tweet of one of his previous tweets elsewhere where he stated, quote, "Leftists don't ignore hypocrisy and right-wingers do, has to be one of the most ill-informed, retarded political takes I have ever heard in my entire life, at Sleepy Devo." Now, it does appear that this clip was hosted on Destiny's channel, but to be honest, I couldn't be bothered to find the exact clip. And as previously mentioned, Dev ends up agreeing with the take he provided in this clip anyways with what context was provided. So as a result, I'm just going to show the actual clip that was provided in the tweet itself here now.
On some level, I think the right wing just has a natural advantage when it comes to this sort of edgy speech, because loyalty allows them to ignore hypocrisy. And leftists don't do that. Like liberals don't ignore hypocrisy, but right-wingers do, because they have different moral values here. Because the left generally is more focused on criticism rather than loyalty, that highlights the hypocrisy. So I think in this conversation, in this domain, the left just always has a natural disadvantage.
So as you can see in the clip, Dev is arguing that the far left don't ignore hypocrisy where he believes the right does, because he believes that the right has a set of moral values that don't prioritize caring about hypocrisy, whereas the left do have a set of moral values that prioritize caring about hypocrisy. But as previously mentioned, there isn't a whole lot of context behind this clip, so what we need at this point is Dev confirming that he agrees with this take. And with that in mind, let's continue. As Dev responded with, quote, "read height," to which Minorically responds with, quote, "I did. You're using him like how leftists use Marx. Just because he said something, does that automatically make it correct, yes or no?" Dev responds with, quote, "Sure, but he's generally correct on this. And by the way, you know this. Every time you laugh at the left eating their own lamau, that's the part of their subculture that is self-critical, currently activated." Minorically replies with, quote, "You know you're committing an unbelievably embarrassing appeal to authority, but this is who you are now. It's really sad. You're not saying how he is correct, you're just saying that he is correct, just like leftists do with Marx." To which Dev replies with, quote, "Here's how he's correct. I've observed what he's described, as have you, every time the left eats its own. The left is more prone to purity spirals. Everybody who has had a left the left arc can attest to it." After this point, point, the conversation then changes subject to whether or not J.D. Vance is a neo-reactionary, which is, of course, not relevant at all to the discussion of whether or not the far left actually cares about hypocrisy, and thus, for our purposes, this is where the discussion ends. But the big takeaway here is that yes, Dev ultimately agrees with the position he took in that clip, and his reasoning for doing so, for arguing that the far left actually cares about hypocrisy, is that they engage in purity spirals. But is this actually true? Is it really the case that the far left engages in purity spirals because it cares about hypocrisy? Well, let's take arguably the most famous example of the far left engaging in a purity spiral, that being their shunning of JK Rowling, which has included the claim that the goblins are supposed to be an anti-Semitic portrayal of Jewish people, something that has been claimed for the record since 2011 at the very latest, as demonstrated by this article. Unsurprisingly, the cancellation of JK Rowling occurred far later, and conveniently only began once she revealed herself to be a TERF who prioritizes women's rights over trans rights. Prior to this, JK Rowling was a star among the far left. Harry Potter was considered the cultural icon of the far left, and none of these far leftists you would think had heard or cared about the goblin angle until the moment that JK Rowling came out as a TERF, at which point it became one of the main criticisms towards her, outside of the far more direct criticism of her being anti-trans. For Dev to argue that the far left actually cares about hypocrisy, in this situation he would have had to take up the position that absolutely no one heard about the goblin situation in the far left, until she came out as a TERF, at which point, miraculously, every single far leftist in existence knew all about the goblin angle and was suddenly an expert on the subject. The more practical answer to this whole conundrum is that Dev is wrong about the far leftists caring about hypocrisy in this situation. They weren't going after JK Rowling over the whole goblin situation because she was a hypocrite. They were doing it because it was a convenient vector of attack over JK Rowling daring to show some basic disloyalty to their form of far leftist ideology by coming out as a TERF instead of a pro-trans activist. In other words, not only is Dev wrong in that example, but he is completely backwards in it as well. The far leftists don't engage in purity spirals over signs of hypocrisy, they engage in purity spirals over signs of disloyalty. Their ideology is so intolerant to other forms of thinking that they will stop seeing you as a fellow far leftist the moment you say anything that disagrees with their worldview. And because they stop seeing you as a far leftist, they don't even really see it as attacking their own at that point. It's just another purge of fakers at that stage. But if you still believe that the far left do actually care about hypocrisy instead of loyalty, or more specifically, loyalty to ideology, consider the fact that the main critique that everyone had of the far left, ever since the culture war began, has been their blatant hypocrisy. Phrases like "imagine if the roles were reversed" or "a rule for thee and not for me" exist for a reason. The far left were being told of their blatant hypocrisy for well over a decade. They had ample time to purge said hypocrisy from their ranks, and yet consistently only chose to go after hypocrisy as a critique the moment that the target of their attack happened to show any signs of disloyalty. For the far left, hypocrisy was an excuse, but never the actual reason. Yet Dev would have you believe the exact polar opposite, despite the mountains of evidence that says otherwise. The final punchline to this whole situation is that Dev himself has dedicated entire videos in the past to the inherently hypocritical nature of the far left, meaning he has zero excuse to feign ignorance on this particular subject because he himself has covered it in detail in the past. The only conclusion that one could possibly make from this is that Dev is just arguing in bad faith. But of course, don't say that to Dev, because then he'll ban you from his free speech platform, because Dev is totally not a hypocrite.